When we begin to talk about the free women of Torvaldsland from a by-the-book standpoint, we are immediately faced with the complete lack of useful information from which to present. There are only 3 examples of free women in Torvaldsland in Marauders: Hilda the Haughty, Bera the Jarl's woman of Bluetooth, and the unnamed sister of Hrolf of the Inlet of Green Cliffs. While there are other free women in Marauders of Gore, they are captured from Cassau, which is not traditionally accounted as being of Torvaldsland, as it is south of the Torvaldsmark. The Torvaldsmark is a huge needle-like runestone on the Skerry of Einar. That is one of the ways in which the men of the north mark the southern boundary of Torvaldsland. While it is tempting to quickly dive into the information that we do have on these 3 women, the sad truth is that much of the information deals with clothing and dressing and gives us little or no insight into the nature of what it means to be a free woman in Torvaldsland. So if you will bear with me, I would like to take a moment to set the stage for the land in which they live instead. As I have noted in prior classes in Torvaldsland, the country of Torvaldsland is a bleak, harsh land primarily populated by small high farms situated along the coast above the fjords and inlets of the Torvaldsland shore. So let's then proceed to offend every free woman of Torvaldsland with the opinion held by Tarl in regards to the people of Torvaldsland. In Beasts of Gore, as Tarl is considering his choices of free companion, he proffers the following reflection. There were various Jarls in Torvaldsland who had daughters, but these, generally, were ignorant, primitive women. Moreover, no one Jarl held great power in Torvaldsland. It was not uncommon for the daughter of a Jarl in that bleak place, upon the arrival of a suitor, to be called in from the pastures, where she would be tending her father's ver. We know that not every man of Torvaldsland was a Jarl. To assume such is a blatant onlineism, confused by the tradition that slaves call all men Jarl, regardless of rank. Jarls of Torvaldsland are of the highest rank of the high men of Torvaldsland, equivalent to the Ubar of the south. The Jarl replaces the Ubar on the northern version of the Kaisa board as the most powerful piece. So consider Tarl's opinion that a daughter of a Jarl in Torvaldsland was little more than an ignorant and primitive woman. There were various Jarls in Torvaldsland who had daughters, but these, generally, were ignorant, primitive women. Moreover, no one Jarl held great power in Torvaldsland. It was not uncommon for the daughter of a Jarl in that bleak place, upon the arrival of a suitor, to be called in from the pastures, where she would be tending her father's ver. Beasts of Gore. So from this passage, what do we learn and what does it mean? First, that there are many minor Jarls of Torvaldsland, who might have so little to their name that their own daughters were out tending the fields. We know from Marauders that such a home would have likely been on the coast, far from other farms, trying to make a living off fishing, limited farming, and flocks of ver, bosk, or even tarsk. We can suppose that from this example, these free women did not grow up in a home that had many slaves, or certainly not enough slaves that they themselves were not required to work. For many free women of Torvaldsland, even those who were daughters of Jarls, it was a harsh, rough life. In this example, the Jarls being spoken of would have been minor Jarls, perhaps equivalent to a squire or baron of medieval England. Secondly, we can suppose that education was either not available or not of great importance, as the daughters are described as both ignorant and primitive. We can, of course, make the supposition that such a description, being made by Tarl, was perception by comparison to the rest of Gore, and not representative of universal ignorance. But surely, if they could read, they knew little more than how to read lists and recipes, and the great literature of R was not available to them. They would have certainly known how to count, but the concept of higher mathematics might be a vastly unknown subject. They would have the knowledge of any woman born on a farm, knowing the growing season, the tending of animals, cooking, cleaning, and so forth, but have little or no skill in politics, or perhaps even much knowledge of the other cultures outside of their own.
Ladies, are we? Interestingly, the word lady in Marauders of Gore is used in reference to theory of Cassel and used mockingly at that. The second use of the word lady is used by Tarl to Hilda the Haughty, when Tarl is disguised as a perfumer to gain access to her chambers with Forkbeard. Is this simply an oversight by John Norman? I say it's not, at least not in the view of Tarl, who thinks this of her. One might have thought she, Hilda, was a great lady, and not the insolent, though curvaceous, brat of a boorish sea rover. Let us not forget that Hilda was the daughter of Thorgard of Skagnar, the enemy of Svein Bluetooth, and accounted as having power equal to the High Jarl. The third and final use of the word lady is to Bera, the free companion and Jarl's woman of Bluetooth himself. Is it my supposition that the free women of Torvaldsland are not ladies? No. But it is clear that at least in the opinion of a well-traveled man such as Tarl, that the women of Torvaldsland, most raised on small farms, are not bound by the same restrictions of the free women of the southern cities. Not only are veils not required in Torvaldsland, they are simply not worn at all. Further, we know that at least Bera, the High Jarl's woman of Torvaldsland, went about showing the whiteness of her arms.
Average free women. And yet, aside from Bera and Hilda, two of the highest ranked and wealthiest women in Torvaldsland, the average free woman of Torvaldsland probably lived in a small farm, where they were tending ver along with Bosk and Tarsks, and very likely gardening, fishing, weaving, and cooking. Because if the daughter of a Jarl was tending ver, what was the daughter of a free farmer doing? Certainly not sitting on her lily-white hands while Bonds did all the work. Further, for those who think that every farm and minor Jarl's holding had slaves, I would like to remind you of the following passages in Marauders. It is explained to some of us that some of the free farmers could not attend the thing as they were the sole workers of the land. And then, when a war arrow was carried to many of the farms, the man left to go to war, leaving his free companion and children behind, often to great hardship. There is no mention to bonds or thralls in the passage. And finally, it is said that it was captains and jarls who brought bonds to the Thing Fair, possibly implying that only men of rank and wealth had bondmaids.
But we will discuss this further in our bondmaids class. I present it here for the free women to consider that the average free woman was unlikely to be free from the requirement to work alongside her father or companion.
Education. But what of education? We know from the books that at least Forkbeard, as a man who considers himself of the rank of Jarl, was disparaging of literacy for himself and hired others to read for him. What then would the likely level of education afforded to free women have been? While we are not told anything whatsoever other than Tarl's clear opinion presented earlier as ignorant, it is reasonable to assume that a country that is primarily populated by small farms and holdings, that
education at the level of southern cities is not readily available.
But let me not further offend my countrywomen and say we should not confuse ignorance for stupidity, and I am sure the free women of Torvaldsland were widely educated on the needs of their families and farms. Surely if they could read, they knew little more than how to read lists and recipes. The great literature of art was not available to them. They would have certainly known how to count, but the concept of higher mathematics might be a vastly unknown subject. They would have the knowledge of any woman born on a farm, knowing the growing season, the tending of animals, cooking, cleaning, and so forth, but have little or no skill in politics, or perhaps even much knowledge of their cultures outside their own.
Freedom. But what does all of this mean to us? In a word, freedom. As women, early in the feminist movement, burned their bras, I say to my proud countrywomen, burn your veils. Shed the restrictions of oh-so-proper Victorian manners. Embrace your land and your upbringing. Put your blushes to the side, my fellow farm girls, and if you can wrap your prudity around you, do so boldly and proudly. Set aside your affected innocence. The bondmaids of the north thought of the southern Kajira as spoiled, excessively pampered, indulged, and coddled, sleek pets who had little to do but adorn themselves with cosmetics and wait their masters, cuddled cutely on plush scarlet coverlets fringed with gold. Can you simply for a moment imagine what the strong, hard-working free women of Torvaldsland think of the cloistered, tea-sipping southern free women?
Our men. It is clear that Forkbeard clearly did not approve of the making of the women of Torvaldsland into bondmaids. And while certainly the outlaw camp of Thorstein and its men had no use for free women, who are these men, the companions of Torvaldsland's free women? Many of them were giants, huge men, inured to the cold, accustomed to war and the labor of the oar, raised from boyhood on steep, isolated farms near the sea, grown strong and hard on work and meat and cereals. Such men from boyhood and harsh games had learned to run, to leap, to throw the spear, to wield the sword, to wield the axe, to stand against steel, even bloodied, unflinching. Such men these would be the hardest of the hard, for only the largest, the swiftest, and finest might win for themselves a bench on the ship of a captain, and the man great enough to command such as these must be first and mightiest among them. Power of the Northern Free Women. So, not only are we freed from the restriction of Southern high society, we are freed from the robes of concealments and restrictive dressing codes. We are the companions, mothers, and daughters of these huge, strong men. But in addition, it is implied that we have even more power than those of the South. On the Kaisa board of the North, there is no Obara. Instead, there is a piece called the Jarl's Woman, which is quite powerful, more so than the Southern Ubara. This authority is seen to be borne out by examples we see in Marauders of Bera, the Jarl's Woman of Bluetooth, the High Jarl of Torvaldsland. When Forkbeard presents himself before Bluetooth, who is infuriated by the arrival of Bluetooth, it is Bera who invited Forkbeard to the hall. Bluetooth did not gainsay her. The woman of the Jarl had spoken. Free women in the north have much power. Here, Norman restates, the Jarl's Woman in the Kaisa of the north is a more powerful piece than the Ubara in the Kaisa of the south. This is not to deny that the Ubara in the south, in fact, exercises as much or more power than her northern counterpart. It is only to recognize that her power in the south is less explicitly acknowledged. Further, at the Thing Fair, when Bera meets up with Forkbeard and his girls, she commands the bondmaids to curdle their shame, and Forkbeard supports her order to them, repeating it, commanding them to dress. This is an example of a free woman commanding the slaves of a free man, and his support of her command. Obviously, even in the north, it is the common practice of free women, for some reason, to attempt to make a female slave ashamed of her body.
Oops, he didn't mean it. Let's not misunderstand Forkbeard's support of Bera's command. The minute Bera was out of sight and Tarl asked who that was, Forkbeard explains it was Bera, the companion to Sven Bluetooth, who added then that he thought Bluetooth should put Bera in a collar and whip her. This is the same man who is clearly opposed to the making of the free women of Torvaldsland into bondmaids. Poor Tarl was scandalized at the very thought. Just as Forkbeard looked to his girls and saying, "What have you done? Drop your kirtles and hitch them up." So clearly, as Forkbeard gave Bera tongue-in-cheek respect for her command, the minute she was out of sight, he did as he pleased. I take this as a continuation of the explanations above. The men of Torvaldsland may be more likely to explicitly acknowledge the authority of a free woman and then do as they please.
Bondmaid Circle. Speaking of doing as they please, a free woman, while treated with great respect by the average man of Torvaldsland, faces two very real threats to her freedom. The first is that it is law in Torvaldsland that if a free woman enters a bondmaid circle of her own volition, or even if tossed into one bound and naked, she becomes a bondmaid. by the law of Torvaldsland. So, even if Bluetooth put up with Bear's behavior for what appears to be many years, and Forkbeard took a dim view of the collaring of the women of Torvaldsland, any man can be pressed far enough, as we see in the example above, to strip a free woman and throw her body into a bondmaid's circle. Her status changed forever by law. Lo, my countrymen, pick your battles carefully, for just as we see in the books of Southern gore, the bitch earns a collar, not a free rein. The duel. The second way in which a free woman may find herself facing a change of status is the formal duel. Again, it is by the law of Torvaldsland that a man, incredibly enough, may be challenged, risking his life among the hazel wands. He may be slain, then, too, of course, the stake, the farm, the companion, the daughter, is surrendered by law to the challenger. And while the motivation of the custom is to enable strong, powerful men to obtain land and attractive women, encouraging them to keep themselves in fighting condition, the common use of the formal duel was used for reputable purposes, such as settling grievances over boundaries or obtaining satisfaction in case of an insult. Quote, "A man, incredibly enough, may be challenged and risks his life among the hazel wands. He may be slain. Then, too, of course, the stake, the farm, the companion, the daughter, is surrendered by law to the challenger." Marauders of Gore. In this passage, Bjarni of Thornstein Camp has challenged Hrolf of the Inlet of Green Cliffs for his sister. The challenge takes place at the Thing Fair. Bjarni wishes to have the girl as a bond, and her brother refuses, so Bjarni has challenged the boy for the girl. While I've not copied the entire passage from the book on this page, for it is lengthy, we do learn a number of things. First, we learn that a woman can become a slave through a formal challenge, and it is by the law of Torvaldsland that a woman won in such combat may become this property of the winner. We also know that she may retain her freedom and become the free companion of the winner. Such an event does not guarantee that she becomes a slave.
You can find more about free companionship quotes at www.portofironhall.com, free companion quotes.
We learn also a little later on that free companionships are also arranged through dowry. A dowry is what the woman's family gives to the man.
Dowry and bride price is also available with full quotes at www.portofironhall.com.
Quote, "These I give to you, champion," said the boy, trying to push into my hands the 3 tarn discs of silver. "Save them," said I, "for your sister's dowry in her companionship." Marauders of Gore.
Damned onlineisms. This portion of Marauders has given rise to the complete onlineism of claiming a free companion by the ridiculous assertion that the only thing a free man needs to do to acquire a free companion is grabbing some unsuspecting free woman and toss her over his shoulder. In truth, just as in the South, with the exception of the rare case of being challenged for your companion, daughter, or sister, companionship in the North is arranged through the exchange of dowry.
Clothing and dress. So, phew, we have finally finished all the preamble, on to clothing and dress, and back to our 3 free women. Of Green Cliffs. The sister of Hrolf of Green Cliffs is described as being dressed in the full regalia of the North. Her clothes were not rich, but clean and her best. She wore 2 brooches and black shoes, a knife in a sheath at her belt. Her hair was braided, as is commonly assumed to be the hairdressing of an uncompanioned free woman. The brooches were likely crafted by a northern craftsman, and greater worth than the crafted items of the South. Quote, "The stake in this challenge was the young man's sister, a comely blonde lass of 14 with braided hair. She was dressed in the full regalia of a free woman of the North. The clothes were not rich, but they were clean and her best. She wore 2 brooches and black shoes. The knife had been removed from the sheath at her belt. She stood straight, but her head was down, her eyes closed. About her neck, knotted, was a rope. It fastened to a stake in the ground near the dueling square. She was not otherwise secure. Marauders of Gore. We learn most interesting that what the woman is wearing is described as the full regalia of the North, and an interesting turn of phrase that seems to imply a recognizable costume. The implication here could be taken to mean that there were recognizable standards for what women of Torvaldsland wore, at least for their best. 3 other items are specifically mentioned: 2 brooches, black shoes, and a knife. While I am loath to use the description of the woman in Cassau in an article in Torvaldsland, we can look to there for better explanations of these items. Brooches. The large blonde woman in the temple crowd at Cassau is wearing a silver brooch on her cloak. Quote, "It was fastened by a large circular brooch of silver, probably from Tharna." We know that brooches were made by northern craftsmen as well. Quote, "A lovely brooch, for example, wrought by a northern craftsman, would be seldom broken or mutilated." And we will see this again when we study Bera, the High Jarl's woman, that she had brooches of carved horn. Quote, "She wore 2 brooches, both carved of the horn of the Kaiuak, mounted in gold."
The slender bond girl in the temple crowd of Cassau is also wearing black shoes. Quote, "She wore shoes of black polished leather which folded about her ankles, laced twice, once across the instep, once about the ankle." The shoes of the same girl are described again. The buckle from Kos was expensive. Even the shoes of black leather were finely tooled. However, it is also clear from this passage that the free women of Torvaldsland always wore shoes. It seems relevant, perhaps, that a particularly poor free woman might do without shoes often, perhaps saving them for festive or important occasions. I quote, "It seemed Agaful, proud and rich, would go barefoot, like a peasant wench or a stripped bondmaid, by the will of Ivar Forkbeard, until her ransom was paid at the Skerry of Einar 5 nights from this night by the runestone of the Torvaldsmark." Please note that Agilfa is from Cassau, not of Torvaldsland, but the quote compares her lack of shoes to either a peasant wench, assumably a free woman, or a stripped bondmaid. There is often some discussion as if to bonds ever wore shoes or possibly boots, even in winter. We of course find it highly unlikely that any human creature could walk out into the snow in the depths of winter, as is common to Torvaldsland, without foot coverings. But by this passage we see that Forkbeard clearly saw no reason to shave said shoes. I quote, "Ivar Forkbeard reached down to the planking on the deck and picked up Agilfu's shoes and hose where they had been discarded before they had been removed and her ankles bound. He threw them over the side." I suspect this has more to do with Forkbeard making a point to Agilful that he intends to make her a bondmaid than the fact that the bonds never wore foot coverings. When we look at Hilda the Haughty, we see she had golden shoes. My assistant and I knelt before her at her feet. She wore beneath her green velvet golden shoes.
Hair, uncompanioned. We will come back to the knife later on in class, but we should make a comment about the state of this girl's hair. Quote, "A comely blonde lass of 14 with braided hair." Of the 3 women of Torvaldsland that we are examining, 2 are uncompanioned. The second, Hilda the Haughty, also wears her hair in braids, but tied with golden strings. Quote, "Her hair, long, was braided. It was tied with golden string." The third woman is companioned, Bera. We will see wears her hair up in a comb. Hilda the Haughty. Hilda the Haughty, the daughter of Thorgard of Skagnar, a powerful and wealthy Jarl of Torvaldsland, also wore her hair in braids, but her hair was tied with golden cords. She wore rings on her fingers, bracelets on her wrists of gold and silver, and 4 looped golden chains with pendants about her neck. She wore a dress of green velvet crossed high about her neck, trimmed with gold, golden shoes, and scarlet silken hose. In her chests, Hilda had scarves and thick covering mantles. Let us then proceed and look at what Hilda is wearing. We know already that she is wearing her hair braided with golden strings, and she has on golden shoes. First, we see she is wearing velvet, a most interesting choice for Norman to make, as velvet is not a simple fabric to make, requiring a special loom. Velvet was incredibly expensive to make without power looms, and not made in any Scandinavian country that we know of during medieval times. Quote, she wore rich green velvet closed high about her neck, trimmed with gold. I point this out because it does not lead me to question if such a garment of velvet was what was meant by the full regalia of the North, or rather the choice of one of the more powerful women in Torvaldsland. Please note that some of the wealthier girls in the crowd of Cassel were also wearing velvet. Jewelry was obviously of vast fascination to Hilda, though we saw the daughter from Greencliffs sporting only 2 brooches. Her hands wore many rings. About her neck she wore looped 4 chains of gold with pendants. On her wrists were bracelets of silver and gold. Rings, bracelets, golden chains, golden string, velvet gowns, and not a single bit more useful information as to what any of it looked like. Quote, I held her forearms. Ivar Forkbeard quickly pulled the bracelets and rings from her wrists and fingers. We then threw from her neck the golden chains. I pulled her to her feet, holding her wrists. Ivar tore the golden string from her hair, loosening it. It fell behind her, blonde, below the small of her back. He tore the collar of her gown back from her throat, opening it at her neck. We see that there were at least scarves in her chests, for all the good that does us. The Forkbeard was looking about the room. From a small chest he took a thick covering cloth, orange. From the chest he took a scarf. An additional quote describes the orange thing as a mantle. He threw the mantle over his head and, with the scarf, turned twice about her neck and knotted tightly, tied it under her chin. Oh goodness, imagine that. Fancy scarlet hose with those golden shoes. Quote, Ivar Forkbeard then bent to the girl's feet and pulled away her golden shoes and, his hands at her legs, she, her eyes closed, removed from her too her scarlet silken hose.
Vera, the free companion of Sven Bluetooth, Jarl's woman of the High Jarl of Torvaldsland, is described as wearing a cape of fur, of white sea sleen, thrown back to reveal the whiteness of her arms. Her kirtle was the finest wool of Ar, dyed scarlet with black trimming. She wore 2 brooches carved of the horn of the Kaluk, mounted in gold. At her waist was a jeweled scabbard, holding the ornamented, twisted blade of a Turian dagger, as is commonly carried by the free women of Torvaldsland. At her belt hung her scissors and a ring of many keys, indicating her hall contained many chests or doors. The scissors and keys indicated she was the mistress of a great house. Her hair was worn high, wrapped in a comb of kalika, indicating that she stood in companionship. At another time, Abera is described as wearing a kirtle of yellow wool with a scarlet cape from the fur of the Red Sea sleen with necklaces of gold. In both cases, her dress is described as being ankle length. Please note the term ankle length, not floor length.
The free woman was a tall woman, large. She wore a great cape of fur, of white sea sleen, thrown back to reveal the whiteness of her arms. Her kirtle was of the finest wool of Ar, dyed scarlet with black trimmings. She wore 2 brooches, both carved of the horn of the Kalawak, mounted in gold. At her waist she wore a jeweled scabbard, protruding from which I saw the ornamented, twisted blade of a Turian dagger. Free women in Torvaldsland commonly carry a knife. At their belt, too, hung her scissors, and a ring of many keys. indicating that her hall contained many chests or doors. Her hair was worn high, wrapped about a comb matching the breeches of the horn of Callaway. The fact that her hair was worn dressed indicated that she stood in companionship. The number of keys, together with the scissors, indicated that she was mistress of a great house. She had gray eyes, her hair was dark, her face was cold and harsh. She lifted the hem of her kirtle of scarlet wool about the ankles of her black shoes and turned away. She looked back, briefly, once. She indicated the kneeling slaves. "Kirtle their shame," she said, then strode away, followed by several men-at-arms. Near him, beside the high seat, sat his woman, Bera, her hair worn high on her head, in a kirtle of yellow wool with scarlet cape of the fur of the Red Sea sleen, and about her neck necklaces of gold.
While it is clear, as an allegorical example, that one of our three women of Torvaldsland was a raving, egotistical bitch that thought herself the equal of any Ubara of the South, we must stop and consider for a moment her very name, Hilda the Haughty. One does not name someone with such an appellation because she is the common example of a culture. Vlad the Impaler was not called the Impaler because mass murder by impalement was common for Romania. So here we see the example of what Tarl himself thought of her. I quote, "I smiled, though secretly. The haughty wench would rob us of our entire stores. None of that richness I knew would grace the neck or breast of a mere bondmaid. She, Hilda the Haughty, daughter of Thorgard of Skagnar, would keep it for herself. Uncork it for me, you sleen," she said. I wondered if I had in my life ever seen so scornful, so proud, so cold a woman. In the story, it is clear that not only was Hilda disparaging of the various perfumes being offered to her by the lowly, albeit disguised perfumers, she with some authority thought she could send them to punishment or death. Again and again we tried to please the daughter of Thorgard of Skagnar. We had little success. Sometimes she would wince or make a face or indicate disgust with a tiny motion of her hand, a movement of her head. We were almost finished with the vials in the flat leather case. "We have here," said I, "a scent that might be worthy of an Ubara of R." I uncorked it and held it out delicately to her nostrils. "Barely adequate," she said. I restrained my fury. The scent I knew a distillation of 100 flowers, nurtured like a priceless wine, was a secret guarded by the perfumers of R. "Yes," she said, "you have annoyed me. I have been patient with you. I am now no longer patient." "Have pity, great lady," I wept. "Leave me now," she said. "Go below. Ask there to be stripped and beaten. Then swiftly take your leave of the house of Thorgard of Skagnar. Be grateful that I have permitted you your lives."
How to play a free woman. And to close this class, I would say to each of you who want to know about the personality of free women of the North, and how to play a free woman in Gore or Torvaldsland, that you take the advice of Branwen the Crow.
In such a way that does not earn you a collar, for then you are no longer a free woman. Might I pull my skirts about me, hold my head high, regal, strong, and proud of my land, its culture, its heritage, its gods, and most importantly, its men.